Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Encounter, the show where we bring you face to face with today's pioneers, innovators, and trailblazers. I am your host, Janaki Ram, and today I'm thrilled to welcome an extraordinary guest to our program, Erica Brescia.
Thanks for having me. It's so good to be here with you.
Awesome. So let me introduce Erica. She's currently the managing director at Redpoint Ventures, a VC firm that focuses on infrastructure, DevOps, open source, and security startups. Prior to this, Erica was the chief operating officer at Github, the most popular platform that doesn't need any introduction, which is used for development and collaboration of open source software. Prior to GitHub, she was the co-founder and COO at Bitnami, a company that has left a significant mark in the world of cloud and cloud native, which was eventually acquired by VMware. Erica, it's an honor to have you on my show.
Thanks again. This is fun. As we mentioned before, we met years and years ago, and it's always nice to get a chance to catch up as the world has changed so much.
Absolutely. You may not remember, but I first actually met you while you were still at Bitnami, and I was at AWS. This was a long ago. So
I do remember, as a matter of fact, I do. long ago.
Awesome.
We won't date ourselves.
So Erica, I had a lot of respect for Bitnami because you started with the open source marketplace that had these AMIs initially targeting EC2. Then you started delivering on-prem VMs, and with multi-cloud, I think Bitnami was the very first open source catalog of AMIs and VMs that targeted multiple clouds. And then what was very interesting is, along with the industry, you transitioned to cloud native. You became more cloud native. You started to ship Docker images for similar software, and then eventually Helm. And your team did a fantastic job of curating and maintaining Helm charts. So personally, I'm very curious on how you got started at Bitnami and how you kept up with the pace of the industry.
Yeah, it's a great question. And a funny side note that things have come full circle on that note, because I actually invested in Solomon Hykes, the creator of Docker's new company, and I'm working with him again. So
fantastic.
Yeah, it's very fun. But to answer your question, Bitnami was all about making software easier for people to consume. Like, we wanted to make open source accessible to everybody. And we actually started even before cloud and AMIs with native installers. And then it was virtual machine images, right? And then it was AMIs, and then it was containers and Helm charts, and ARM templates and everything else. And, it was always with that goal of how can we make it easy to spin up an open source app. And if you go all the way back to when I got involved in open source in 2005, I joined forces with a guy who was a very early contributor to Apache. And he had been involved in open source early on. And funny enough, we'd built this packaging tool, and he decided he was involved in Mono. He built Mod Mono, which let you run Mono on Apache. And Mono was really complicated to install. And so he took our installation tool and he took Mono and all of its dependencies and packaged them up and put it next to, the tar files and everything else that you could download.
So let me stop you there. Was it Nat Friedman?
No, it was a guy named Daniel Lopez. But
Okay.
it is a funny connection that you noted. And obviously years later, I went to go work with Nat at GitHub. But no, and Daniel actually introduced me to Nat. So that's how that connection came about. My co-founder, Daniel, introduced me to Nat Friedman. They did know each other all the way back then. Of course, Nat was building Xamarin. And what we saw was the install packages that we had built were getting more downloads than all of the other distributed artifacts of Mono combined. And it was funny because at the time, developers, the thought was, developers want to do everything from scratch and compile their own kernel. And really what we saw and what we proved was, no, people just want to get things up and running. And with the explosion of open source, in particular business applications at that time, we had a lot of people that weren't engineers that were maybe trying to get, Sugar CRM or Pentaho or something like that up and running. And so we started building these installers for like LAMP applications first. And then, of course, as cloud, kind of came onto the scene, we started building AMIs before Amazon even had a marketplace. We were publishing to that massive, like, it's basically just like a web page full of AMI listings, if memory serves. And we just saw this incredible growth. We were getting over 1 million deployments a month across all of the platforms that we supported. And I guess the final note on that was, in the process of supporting all these platforms, what we really built was a system for tracking upstream dependencies, kind of downloading every new release, rebuilding all of these open source packages, and then compiling them, or composing them, I should say. It wasn't truly compiling, but composing them into software stacks, and then packaging them in all these formats and publishing them out to the cloud and other platforms, Docker Hub, things like that. So it was really like, CI/CD for open source at the end of the day.
Awesome. So I still remember the username and password of the WordPress stack delivered by Bitnami.
Oh my gosh,
because,
that's awesome.
I deployed it tens of thousands of times. I think, when I was at AWS, when I had to demonstrate the power of EC2, there was this community Bitnami AMI pre-configured with WordPress. You push a button and then it gets deployed. And in no time, you are in front of the WordPress dashboard and you had to log in. So I still remember the username and password that I used, with all the out-of-the-box Bitnami packages. Fantastic stuff.
I love it. It's really fun to hear, I've been traveled the world in this work and to find people who use Bitnami, sometimes, still using Bitnami, which is very cool.
Right. Even today, I think there are a lot of Helm charts that are exclusively available on Bitnami. A lot of open source software. I think that's the first destination that a lot of DevOps engineers go and look for. So even today, I think VMware is managing it well. It is still up to date. It's being maintained pretty well.
Yeah,
so that was the right. So that was the story of Bitnami, and a little bit on how you ended up at VMware and how did the acquisition offer came about.
As with all acquisitions, I think, or most at least, it was a very windy road. So what was interesting was with Bitnami, we had primarily bootstrapped the business, right? We took $1 million in funding, which I know is a lot of money, but in the scheme of Silicon Valley and venture capital, it's nothing, right? It was mostly from individual investors. We went through Y Combinator in 2013. Took a tiny bit of money there, but not much. And so we had really grown the business. We were about 75 people, and we had grown through our contracts with the cloud vendors. So it was Amazon and Microsoft and VMware and Oracle and Google and all these folks that were paying us to deliver and maintain the Bitnami catalog on their platforms, because we drove huge amounts of usage. It was well over 1 billion hours of compute before we were acquired. And so we actually were going, I had talked before about how we had kind of built this CI system almost for open source that was also, taking you all the way through to deployment. And we were about to start selling that into the enterprise. So we had productized it. We were ready to go out and build more of a go-to-market team. We had been like super, super lean on that front. Me, initially, I negotiated all the cloud vendor contracts, and then we had a couple folks that I hired to help with that. But we were going to go raise actual institutional funding, and all the cloud vendors found out about it. And funny enough, it was actually Microsoft that kicked off the acquisition discussions. One of their CVPs flew down to our office and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about buying Bitnami." Felt very dramatic. Actually, at the time, we're all sitting in a conference room. They like flew in with a team to tell us they wanted to buy the company. And, as you do in that kind of a process, you start having other conversations as well. And it turned out that VMware was going to be the best home for Bitnami for a variety of reasons. And what was interesting for me, at least, was in the context of the conversations we were having with Microsoft, they'd also announced the GitHub acquisition. They hadn't closed it yet. Nat asked me to catch up and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about coming to GitHub with me, as part of this acquisition." Well, of course, we ended up selling to VMware and not Microsoft. But Nat and the team said, "Hey, we'd still really like to have you as a part of this." And so I was pretty fortunate to have a very supportive co-founder, because I basically had to negotiate my way out of the acquisition with VMware. And I have to give their team and their corp dev team a lot of credit, because these things can be very tenuous, and having a founder not go with the deal, in particular one who was like very, very involved in the business, and in particular the BD side of things. And, I ran everything other than product and engineering at the time. So that was a little tricky, but folks were great. I think in particular, when I could finally share that it was GitHub that I was going to, people they understood. They're like, how could she possibly, turn down this opportunity to go serve at a company that's at the heart of the ecosystem that we've been, working to serve for so long. So that's how we ended up at VMware, and also how I ended up at GitHub. I might have jumped the gun on a question there, but it's all very tightly tied together, as often happens.
Excellent. You actually partially answered my next question on, how did your move to GitHub happen? But that's pretty fascinating. So Erica, I have a lot of friends and ex-colleagues at GitHub who have high regards for you. I keep hearing great stories from them, and you have been instrumental in expanding GitHub's footprint. Like you set up the satellite, GitHub satellite in India,
Yeah.
and even in other countries. So you spoke about VMware. So tell me, how is it like working at Microsoft? What are your experiences?
I would not say I worked at Microsoft. Still, I would say I worked at GitHub. I think we worked really hard to keep GitHub as independent as possible from Microsoft. And, that's easier said than done in the context of a big company. I think Satya Nadella really understood the importance of GitHub and the developer ecosystem, and that we had to build GitHub in a way that still delivered choice to developers and felt independent. And so there's this really delicate balance between delivering an amazing experience across GitHub and the Microsoft suite of products, which makes a ton of sense and is the right thing to do. It actually makes those developers' lives better, but not kind of preventing them from deploying on AWS or, using systems other than VS Code or whatever it may be. And so, I think that was a constant journey, and it will continue to be a journey for the team that's still there. But I would say, GitHub is such a special place, and has such a special place in the ecosystem. And that's, why I was so drawn to the opportunity to go and serve there. It really did feel like an opportunity to serve the community. And, I've been on the board of the Linux Foundation for almost 8 years now. And that's another kind of avenue through which I've always tried to do what I can as a non-developer to support open source development, right? It's kind of like my way of giving, since I'm not actually writing the code myself. Funny how I ended up in this space, having studied investment finance and not software development. I'm probably one of the only ones, but, I just came in with such like a deference for GitHub's place in the world. And I think, the vast majority of the leadership team felt the same way. Like, we really were there to serve developers and do what we could to create the best home for developers possible. And there were a lot of challenges. I mean, GitHub was, I had somebody tell me it was literally the best instance of product market fit they had ever seen, because the company just absolutely, took off, despite, quite frankly, quite a few flaws. I mean, there was no leadership structure, like no management structure, until the company was over 300 people, which caused some cultural challenges that we had to overcome, because that, rather unsurprisingly, just does not scale. There were a lot of parts of the business and in how we operated that just weren't built up at all. And the company had been, unbelievably successful, but you can only get to so much of a point with that kind of uh, maybe semi-controlled chaos, I'll say, until things start to break. And in particular, when I arrived, we were doing something like 300, 350 in revenue. And, the company publicly announced they crossed $1 billion recently. I do not
Wow.
take credit for that. That Erica Anderson, who is the CRO, funny enough, there were two Ericas on the exec team there, but she is amazing. She's at Notion now. She gets the credit for that. And I think our partnership with Microsoft and the way we navigated that and leveraged the 40,000 sellers that Microsoft at least had in the field at that time really helped accelerate our growth. But there's just a lot that needs to change in a company when you go through that level of scaling. And so, for example, getting intentional about our international expansion, and India was the first. We had a bunch of other markets actually planned because, I used to give this keynote talking about the next 50 million developers and where they're going to come from. And, it's not the US, folks. And GitHub had still been very US centric in its strategy, even though we had employees all over the world. And it was time to get much more intentional about how do we make the right investments in not just India, which was very important. And I think the fastest growing market, and I think maybe the second largest market on GitHub. I know India surpassed China now, which is pretty awesome. But we were looking at Africa and Latin America. And, I think that was twofold. First, I mean, obviously we were running a business. It's a great business opportunity, but also it's just an amazing way to help support developing economies, bringing people into open source, giving them exposure to learn how to code and participate in the global developer community has literally changed people's lives and even changed, financial outcomes in villages and things like that, because they have somebody that goes on to become part of this global community. And I think, again, going back to the responsibility that we all felt at GitHub, that was a huge part of it. Like, how can we help support this next wave of developers and create a home that's welcoming and inclusive and lets them, improve their lives. So it was an amazing journey. I'm really proud to have been a part of it. There's still a lot of things that I would love to go do and fix. I was pulled into venture. I was not planning on going into venture, but funny enough, Satish Dharmaraj, who's one of my partners now, is actually the guy who introduced me to Satya Nadella in 2012, which led to us doing a deal with Microsoft, which led to the eventual acquisition discussions, which led to me taking the COO job. And then he called me about coming into Redpoint. And I was like, wow, this is very full circle. I don't know, years and years and years later.
Fantastic. So Erica, even after being acquired by Microsoft, GitHub remains autonomous and independent. Despite the close integration with Azure, I think Microsoft has successfully managed to preserve that as a separate brand. But initially, when there was this news that Microsoft is going to acquire GitHub, there were a lot of concerns. Suddenly, people felt the open source is going to be stifled and it's going to be constrained. And wow, Microsoft is acquiring GitHub, and this is going to be this is going to change the open source dynamics quite a bit. But interestingly, even today, we see a lot of Microsoft competitors confidently putting up their open source repos, and some of the largest projects collaboratively are run on GitHub, which are coming from Microsoft competitors. So what are your thoughts? What gives them that confidence that despite being a Microsoft asset, running their successful, large, collaborative open source projects on GitHub?
I think there's a few things. And again, I'll give Satya credit here. I really do think he is one of the best, if not the best, business leader of our time. And I think the transformation that Microsoft has gone both culturally and embracing open source, as well as just with cloud and now with AI, is truly remarkable and something that most people have not pulled off. And I'll say, Nat had a direct line to Satya throughout the acquisition discussions and keeping GitHub as independent was a big part of that. And I think, one thing that helped a lot is if you looked at GitHub, we had something called our core 4 metrics. And I used to point out, even when I was hiring people, 2 of those metrics were entirely just related to platform growth and adoption, not revenue. And then another one was ARR, and another one was contribution margin, which is basically like profitability. And I think that's a really important statement. Like, hey, we are here to build a business, but it is just as important that we build the community. And I think, as with building any company culture, like aligning on these values and these priorities is really important, because then what happens is it shows up throughout all the decisions that you make. And I think that's how we built trust. It's not 1 or 2 things, right? It's how did we think about GitHub Actions, and how did we handle go-to-market on that, right? Is there a button that says deploy to Azure, but not one that says deploy to AWS? No, right? Like, these were discussions that we had all the time. It was very intentional. For example, when I did my first Universe keynote, which is GitHub's big global developer conference, I had Amazon on stage, not somebody from Microsoft, right? And so, like, we were very deliberate and thoughtful about the way that we told the GitHub story, the way that we made product decisions, the way that we sold. That really needs to permeate every aspect of the business. We had our own PR and comms team. We had our own voice, everything was like pretty well contained within GitHub. And I'll be honest with you, like, there were a lot of mini battles on that front constantly. Will we move over to Microsoft's security suite of tools? Will we move over to O365 from, the Google suite, which is what GitHub still uses today, as far as I know? We were still on Slack. We used Zoom, right? It was like a million little skirmishes along the border, kind of in constant defense. But I think, that's a normal thing to happen in the context of a big company with a lot of different divisions. Of course, everybody wanted us using their suite of products, but I think it's Satya's vision and support for GitHub as an independent player that let us operate the way that we did, and in turn build trust that would allow, competitors to continue to host code on their platform. Like, I think we did the right things, and we showed that we were going to keep the company independent, and we proved it over and over and over again in our decision making.
Awesome. So shifting gears, tell us about Redpoint Ventures and some of your portfolio companies. So when you invest, what do you look for?
I'd love to. So Redpoint, it's an amazing group of people, which is what brought me to Redpoint. I am a managing director on our early funds. So we have 2 funds. We have an early fund, which invests primarily in Series A's and some concentrated seed bets and some early Series B investments. And then we have what we call our early growth fund that really picks up at Series B and beyond. And in early, we typically write checks in totaling in investments $15-20 million. And kind of early growth comes in from there. I love the early stages because, I think that's in my DNA. I love working with founders at the earliest stages and helping them navigate through finding product market fit and building out their team and culture and figuring out how to operate the business, and then kind of scaling from there. And as you might expect, if you look at my background, I invest almost entirely in anything developer first, as well as security and AI, and AI really in particular at the infrastructure level. On the security front, I spent a lot of time at GitHub on security, both our corporate security as well as software supply chain security, both through my GitHub work and my work with the Linux Foundation. And just as like a citizen of a world that depends on open source, I care deeply about how we secure our software supply chain. But, really across the board, it's how do we make developers' lives better? And you can see that theme in my investments. If you look at, I mentioned Solomon Hike's new company, Dagger. it's completely reinventing CI/CD and bringing true software development and reusability via a set of building blocks to CI/CD, and it has some really interesting applications for AI as well. There's Railway, which is like if you were going to reimagine Heroku for today, and
Yes.
make it serverless and automatically scalable and give you like one-click deployment from GitHub, is really a magical developer experience, and that shows up in the growth that Jake, the founder, posts on. Another investment is Zed. Actually, some GitHub alum, the guys who built Atom and Electron, have built this amazing new code editor built from the bottom up in Rest. It is the fastest editor you've ever seen. And what's really cool and pretty remarkable about it is it gives you Google Doc style collaboration. So, up until today, collaboration around software really happens at the PR, and you lose the discussions and the comments and the rich context that goes into software development. And Zed is kind of reimagining that. So you're bringing the conversation to the line of code and saving it there. So when folks come back later, they can understand what happened over time. And they also let you, from anywhere in the world, jump in and work like Google Doc style on code, which I think is super cool. And recently, I would be very remiss if I didn't mention Poolside. So Jason Warner, who I actually met over 10 years ago when he was back at Canonical, then he went to Heroku, and then, of course, was the CTO of GitHub, VP of engineering before that, and instrumental in GitHub's acquisition by Microsoft. Funny enough, he after that came to Redpoint about 6 months before me. So we worked together at Redpoint. And then at Redpoint, we incubated his new company. We just announced a $26 million seed round, which is beefy, but it's because they are building an entirely new foundation model for code. And really, it's in pursuit of narrow AGI for software development. So
Wow.
our belief is that most software will be built by computers in the future. And we want to build the platform and the tooling and the infrastructure to deliver on that. So super exciting, very full circle for me and for Jason and his incredible founder, ISO. So very excited about that. And of course, I can talk you through the rest of my portfolio as well. I love talking about all my babies, but yeah, I've been here a year and a half. I've done 7 investments, 5 Series A's and 2 C's.
Fantastic.
And all in that.
Very fascinating. Very fascinating. I can't wait to check them out. I particularly the collaborative development tool and the foundation model that brings AGI level intelligence to coding sounds very promising. I'm going to check out all of them. So Erica, you have a vantage viewpoint to this industry because you have been at the forefront of leading the Bitnami, the open source software catalog revolution. You have been a part of Linux Foundation for a long time, and you have watched how collaboration takes place through GitHub. But personally, I feel cloud native has hit a point where it has started to become boring because enterprises are adopting, and
Yep.
it's all, the dust has settled, and it has stabilized. That excitement and that euphoria around cloud native and Kubernetes has reduced, and enterprises are embracing, which means it is getting boring. So what do you think is the next big thing in cloud native?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say there's a couple of trends that I've been seeing. I think WASM in particular is really interesting, and there's some very cool work happening there where you can just get much, much, much better performance and better security with WASM. So I'm really enjoying following what's happening there and the team at Fermion. It's not one of my investments, but I think it's an interesting area of development. I would say another thing is, this stuff has gotten so freaking hard. Like, it's just so complex to build and manage these systems. And another trend that you'll see in my investing is like, how do we simplify this, right? Like, we kind of understand how it works. Now, how do we build something that makes it dramatically easier to build and operate these applications? And 2 of my investments, funny enough, both are in Berlin. are kind of in that vein. Zata is a Postgres-based database, but it has built-in search and analytics, and also like this Airtable like UI to make it just dramatically more accessible, especially to front-end developers. But it's like, it's how do we eliminate the complexity of piecing all these different things together to build. And another one, we haven't actually officially announced it, but it's called Restate. It's from one of the creators and two of the core folks from Flink, from Apache Flink. And it's a new backend for distributed systems. And again, it's this theme of like, software goes through these phases of like unbundling and bundling. And I think we're in a bundling phase because cloud native has just gotten too hard, right? Talk to almost anyone, and trying to find and hire great SREs to operate your Kubernetes infrastructure and everything is just, it's really, really hard. And there's a huge shortage of talent. And so I think the next wave will be the wave that makes things easier. And then I guess one final trend, it's always nice to have things come in threes, is it's interesting to see what's happening at the edge. And in particular with data processing at the edge. We have this massive big data problem where companies are getting, petabytes of data, and everybody's, Splunk and all of their logging system bills are going crazy and their data costs are going crazy. And I think there are some really interesting developments that are looking at like, how do we do more of our data processing at the edge in a more efficient way, and then just kind of save the outputs that we need. So I think that's a really interesting trend that I have my eye on as well.
Completely agree. Funny enough, you mentioned about Fermion. So I spent the entire day with Matt,
Nice.
Matt Butcher. Yeah, so Matt and Radu, the CTO of Fermion, they are in Hyderabad. I was with them till like an hour ago. I spoke at the Wasm Day.
Cool.
So I just finished my talk at the CNC of Meet, which was the theme of the CNC of Meet was Wasm. I just presented there, and I'm coming back straight to the interview. So yes.
It's like we planned this, but we didn't. It's the way the world works. That's awesome. Great guys, great team. I'm really excited for them.
Absolutely. Big fan of Fermion and the people there. So I really love what they're doing. Fantastic. So Erica, slightly controversial question. So this could be pure speculation, but a lot of companies, individuals, and developers believe that Microsoft is exploiting GitHub to train the OpenAI code-based foundation models for GitHub Copilot and Copilot X. Yeah. What's your thought? What are your thoughts on this, and how far is it true, and what are the implications of this?
Yeah, it's a great and very complicated question. And let me state for the record, I do not represent GitHub in my comments, nor my lawyer. Always important. So look, I mean, GitHub has been, I think, pretty open in how the code on GitHub has been used to train the models, right? And there have been several blog posts. I think one thing that GitHub has done well and will continue to do well is embrace transparency, and really push the envelope sometimes in terms of what Microsoft would do, and kind of carry that a little bit further, which is great. I think when I think about this, and I realize that not everybody will agree, I believe that, AI code gen models are of social good for the future. Like, I think they're going to unlock a whole new level of creativity. We talked before about like developing countries and bringing opportunity to them. And when you look at the world through the lens of thinking that everybody is going to be able to build software, because we're just going to remove so many of these barriers and so much of this complexity that we were just talking about over time, I think we can unleash a ton of creativity and opportunity to people. And so I try to keep my eyes on that and like, what could this be? And how could this be a service that helps so many people? And then kind of work back from there. And I understand, right? It's fraught. If you write code and you never understood that it would be used to train a model, it can be a little bit jarring to know that your blood, sweat, and tears is going into something like that. But I also think another way to look at it is how many people that it's helping. And, I think this show is going to show up not just in code, but in everything, right? Like, people are scraping images off of websites and whenever there's a new technology, people are going to make mistakes and they're going to go too far, and we're going to legislate it and we're going to have conversations about it and hopefully get to a really good outcome over time. Even I think a lot of the conversations happening around safety and ethics in AI are incredibly important. But I think it's all part of technological development, and quite frankly, I think it's unavoidable. Like it's going, like, I think this is an unstoppable force, and we need to figure out how to work with it in productive ways and put the right safety measures in place and the right licensing models in place and the right, opt-in, if you will, in place. And I think there's a lot of work to do there. But I think, anytime that you release something new, there's always a like, wait a sec, how is this working? I think GitHub was pretty intentional and careful about terms of service and licensing and all of those things. Certainly, we had many, many conversations before we trained the model or released anything, and felt like we were in a good place to do so.
So your answer has been politically correct. You actually managed it pretty well.
That's like a COO that was an executive of a big company.
So Erica, a few months from now, maybe next quarter, I'm going to do a follow-up with you on the code-based LLMs and the foundation models. What are the differentiating factors? What do you see? That's going to make up an interesting follow-up discussion for us.
Yeah, I think so. Lots of exciting stuff happening. It's an amazing time in the world.
On that note, we are almost coming to the end of this interview. So apart from code generation, how do you see generative AI influencing the future of DevOps?
I am probably, if you look at the spectrum of like AI believers, I'm pretty far to the optimistic side of what the future looks like. I think a lot of mundane and manual work is going to go away. And there's already really cool companies that are using AI for developing like test suites, for example. Codium, there's a company doing this, I think is super cool. And I think we're going to see that across the board. Certainly in every single portfolio company conversation that we have, we're talking about AI's impact and the opportunity that it presents for the business, whether it's bringing, collaborative development with an AI chatbot to Zed, or whether it's, looking at Dagger's implications for building models, or whether it's like, how can we simplify building things with Zada via AI assistance? I think, there's going to be this evolution. And I think right now it's all about the assistant and how can we have something that just supercharges our work and like frees our brains to do the more interesting and innovative things instead of, rewriting the same code over and over and over again, which we all know happens constantly in DevOps. And then over time, those systems are going to get smarter and they're going to do more. And it's going to go from being just a little assistant to being an actual developer on our team, right? And then over time, I think it'll go to having conversations like you would with the systems architect, just about, components and structure and architecture. And then over more time, I think it'll go to, hey, go build this app for me, right? And I think, when you think about that as it applies to DevOps, it will get a lot easier to build and manage some of these systems. And again, given the talent shortage that we have and the fact that we have these amazing brains of engineers that are doing the same thing over and over again, I think we're going to be able to make their lives a lot better. So to me, that's a really exciting proposition.
I love the way you bring up your portfolio companies into every question.
How can I not? I love that. Look, I spend so much time with these folks. I feel like I'm part of the team. So I can't, they shape my worldview too. Is the reality, because I'm looking at this through all these different lenses.
No, they're lucky. You are a pretty hands-on person, and you also wear the hat of an investor. So I'm sure they're very, very lucky to get your guidance and the whole view of the market. So So on that note, I want to thank you, Erica, for joining me for this discussion. This has been a fantastic conversation, bringing a lot of dimensions, a lot of angles, very forward looking. So as I mentioned, I am going to come back to you with a follow-up discussion on the foundation models.
Sounds good. This was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Good day.